But before switching topics, is there a book that you can think of that you like to recommend, or you can recommend to someone?
Yeah. Oh man. The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin is not always a book people are ready for, but James Baldwin, for me, and the way I'm wired,
Mm,
I'm a reformer. I'm anywhere environment I'm in, I'm a reformer. That's the through line of my life. Uh, James Baldwin like spoke to me in a way that like few authors, I just resonate so deeply with his work, and that book really changed my life because he was able to very precisely press on, like he showed me like a systemic cultural way to interpret the world,
mm-hmm.
um, from a position of yearning for liberation and like literally being a part of the movement doing it in the civil rights era. That man, and he's also, I think, one of just the most effective users of the English language that was ever born in the U.S. I really believe that when you read or even listen to his work, stunningly good rhetorically,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I respect him a lot. I would also say "Begin Again" by Eddie Glaude Jr. He basically took a lot of Baldwin's best paragraphs and like interacted with them
Mm-hmm.
in the kind of post-Trump era. And I think, he's an incredible scholar and a great writer in his own right. So seeing these like two men interact with each other, learning from both, while one also venerates the prior for impacting, you can see like someone interacting with his hero
Mm-hmm.
while kind of also being that for you. It was just a really great experience for me as a book. I would also, this kind of gets into my my background. Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen DeMay.
Mm-hmm.
She's a historian, and that book kind of drew the lines together for me of what the white evangelical movement has been, not how it understands itself, not the story it tells about itself, but what it's actually done
Mm-hmm.
in the US and the world. She kind of laid out all the receipts. And then kind of later in the book, it got really like biographical. It was like certain chapters where it was like, there's where I was, and that book was hard. But one of those things like where I just think history has so much power to kind of like zoom out and say, all right, where'd this come from? And her whole thing was that kind of where we found ourselves in 16 was kind of like what was going to happen with
Mm-hmm.
where this movement was going, and kind of having spent so much of my adult life within that movement.
Yeah.
It was nothing easy. There was nothing easy about that book. But at the same time, I thought it was really, it was enormously impactful as it affirmed and kind of connected all these like disparate pieces and names that I kind of had on the table of my mind. It kind of drew the lines together in a way that really just kind of snapped the bigger picture into focus. And I think books that can do that, are more than just knowledge, right? It helps
Mm-hmm.
you approach the world in a wiser, more studied way, So I would also say that one was big.
Okay. Well said. It's always nice to hear people share books that have had such a large impact on their lives. And I definitely always like to read books that do just that. And I know I said we're going to move on, but you reminded me of a book that I read that was introduced by a good friend of mine. Shout out to Jimmy. Hope you're doing well. I met him at grad school. He's Navajo.
Okay.
And he recommended me a book called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And it came
Mm.
out, I think, in the 70s. But this book did, laid out all the receipts of war crimes committed by the U.S. government.
Right.
And how essentially not only were Native Americans slaughtered, but they were constantly thrown on the bus and they were constantly being betrayed. Like they would sign a treaty with ex Navajo Nation, and then some businessman or some miner would go out to their lands and discover some mineral, some expensive mineral that could be used for whatever business practice. Like, oh, we have a treaty with them. How about we just look away? We scratch that treaty away and invade anyways. And that occurred pretty much all throughout the 1800s and early
Right.
1900s. It's like, yeah, oh, you have X mineral. Well, say goodbye to your treaty. We're gonna take over
Yes.
now.
Yes.
Yeah, and it gets real graphic too. I still remember a chapter where it discussed the slaughter of children,
Mm.
and a gruesome detail. Thinking, oh my God, this wasn't too long ago,
No.
and this was not at all talked about in any U.S. history class that I've taken. It really tends to. I recall taking U.S. history, and then, oh yeah, the programs came over from England, made friends with the Native Americans, and that's that.
Yes.
They helped them, how to farm, harvest their crops and everything, and then they became friends. Well, that's not really the case.
Yeah. Yeah. I've read multiple authors from an indigenous background, and they've said things like, we really can't do a full reckoning
Mm-hmm.
with the history of our country without having Native people at the table.
Yeah.
And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I mean, when you look at just like, especially when you trace the history of Supreme Court and its rulings, the Marshall Trilogy, I mean, the Doctrine of Discovery, like these are things that people haven't heard of,
Mm-hmm.
but were enormously formative in, like you said, the 1800s, early 1900s,
Mm-hmm.
in just cementing imaginations of inequality within the ethos of our society, and yeah, like you said, just heartbreaking. How could this even happen? Kind of reactions, man, if you haven't read a history book at some point that you just want to throw during your reading of it, like you're reading fan fiction, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's both, I think you have to look back at those eras, and there's always a person or a small minority of people that saw what was going on,
Mm-hmm.
and the name escapes me, but there was basically a missionary advocate in Georgia that literally, stood up about what was going on, and tried to use, their privileged place within that stratified society to say, hey, what's going on here is wrong. Like land's literally just being taken,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, contra to these treaties. Like applying the law would be all we need to do to avoid what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And to see how even those people were destroyed by the system at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just really, I think, like snaps into focus that just oppression and greed and just this like the difficulty of liberation under
Sure.
huge systems. It's a part of every culture, of every society. And, I think those are the kind of things you just have to look at. Like you just have to look at those things straight on
Mm-hmm.
and let it impact you.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it, again, expands your imagination. And I think a little bit starts to inoculate you a little bit to, hold on, like as you
Yeah.
interpret the world
Yeah.
that's closer to where
Yeah.
you live now, just to know that that's kind of the ripples of that are still being felt.
Sure.
It just helps you navigate some of that, even emotionally. I think just to be able to face hard facts
Mm-hmm.
and keep going despite those. Man, I think that might be the foundation of reform, is being able to do that.
Sure. Yeah. As I was reading the book, I had to put it down a couple times because of how graphic the encounters were with ex-Navajo people and the U.S. Military at the time. Like, Jesus, this was completely buried in the history books. I don't think that should be allowed. And if there's one group of people that I could understand and wouldn't mind carrying that flag that says "Don't tread on me," it would be the Native Americans. I'd be fine seeing natives putting that on putting a stick on their pickup truck or carrying around during protests. Like, yeah, sure. I think you have every right to wave that flag around. Not so much people on the right. I'm like, well, not really. How was the government really threatening on you? I'm sure you could find cases, but not to the extent as the Native Americans have experienced.
Yeah, I think when you see like what I would call like true and like vivid victimization, and like the obvious ripple effects that it's had, I think it it makes it harder to accept the victim narratives of other groups, you know, kind of in that same cultural milieu, you know.
Yeah.
And that's not to say like there's not room for grievance or specific, like, hey, this isn't right. Like, sure, you know, you talk about those things, but
Sure.
yeah, I think you're right that there's just, I think, you know, when I would say, I would add, I think what's worse than something not being mentioned at all is quickly being mentioned. Like, and this is, as I reflected on history and kind of the history I got in high school, I remember a lot of like the Trail of Tears, even Wounded Knee, you know, Custer's Last Stand and all this. Like I remember it being mentioned, the Great Migration, you know, I remember like having history lessons about, oh, it was really bad in the South. And, you know, basically from these years to these years, but like, and I get it. Part of it's just, there's a lot to cover, right? But I think the quick mention's almost worse, because I could have told you, oh yeah, I've heard about the Trail of Tears, but then to really feel it viscerally, like to read accounts, to get into like the litigation, like, and I use the word with all possible elasticity that led to that decision being made, just the callous nature of executive order after executive order, just the dehumanizing environment that all this happened with it. Once you start to see all that, all of a sudden, you know, it goes from, yeah, that happened, write that down on a test, right, to something you can kind of feel in your bones as like, wow, this could happen.